Hello and welcome to this short webinar on consent. I'm Chloe and I'm the content coordinator at ShelterBox.
And I'm Anna, I'm an operations coordinator.
So what we will cover is why we need consent, the family's first approach, people in the pictures group, how to prepare to get consent when in the field, different types of consent forms, the right to withdraw consent, alternatives to written consent, and what's expected from you once you have the consent forms. So the reasons why we are doing this webinar and why we ask for consent is we have guidelines that are designed to protect the people whose stories and images we share in all of ShelterBox materials, digital channels and the media. ShelterBox obtains informed consent for case studies and testimonials, photographs and video. Consent to use photos, testimony and footage should be informed consent, and this means that the person understands why ShelterBox wants to interview, photograph and video them, what it will be used for and where the material will be used. Informed consent can only be achieved in the person's own language unless the interviewer is fluent in the local dialect. A translator is essential. To ensure we are obtaining and using material which protects the dignity and the rights of the subjects, we always require informed consent. Where the subject is a child, we must seek informed consent from the adult responsible. We are also doing this to ensure that everyone is up to date with best practices in the field, that we're in line with Bond's People in the Pictures guidelines. We want people to understand why they are agreeing to consent and where that material might go. We are putting the families first when asking for consent. Not only is it the moral thing to do, we also need it in our work as media platforms do not accept our content without consent.
Great, so I'm just going to talk a bit about our families first approach and kind of the rationale for that, where it comes from. So you'll all have heard of the expression white saviour. This refers to a style of fundraising that puts the charity staff, who are usually white or privileged, at centre stage in their storytelling. And this can run the risk of eclipsing the stories of the families who are actually receiving aid. This kind of presentation of ShelterBox staff and volunteers as saviours is not only inaccurate and self-serving, but it can perpetuate stereotypes of beneficiaries as helpless victims rather than as dignified individuals who are driving their own recovery, which we obviously witness and know them to be. So we recognise we have a responsibility to improve public understanding of the capacity and resilience of the families we help and to showcase that really. And for that reason, ShelterBox has decided to put families first in all of our external communications. On a practical level, this means telling their stories rather than viewing the people we help only as subjects in our story. We need to challenge ourselves to create a new narrative through the content that we gather, which not only shows people's problems, but also their personalities and their strengths. So that might look like content which shows people supporting or caring for each other and leading their own recovery. And where possible, we should try to use beneficiaries' own words.
Over the past year, we've been involved in Bond's People in the Pictures group to get a better understanding of gaining informed consent, content gathering in the field, and the ethics around this. There are more than 100 members in the group that represent a range of organisations in international development. So we've been learning from our peers and ensuring we're all adhering to the best practices when in the field. Together, the group has put together ethical guidelines for gathering content in the field. So once these guidelines have been complete, we'll share these with all staff and volunteers to use. The insight gained has been a big driver towards putting together our Families First initiative.
So now I'm going to talk you through a few practical tips when you're preparing for a day in the field where you might be presented with opportunities for content gathering. First of all, it's really important that in your morning briefing you decide which member or members of the team will be focusing on gathering content that day. Obviously, you won't have capacity for everyone to be gathering content and have their cameras out at all times. It's not efficient, it's not appropriate, and so deciding on that content gatherer at the beginning of the day is really important. Also, don't underestimate how long or how time-consuming content gathering can be, and make sure that that team member has got enough time to complete their kind of operational tasks and also do the content gathering, and that they realise that the operational tasks take precedent over gathering content, and if they run out of time, then they should focus on those operational tasks. Second point is that the whole team, not just the person gathering content, needs to be familiar with our guidelines for consent and with those consent forms. It's not just about kind of having read the forms, it's also about making sure that all of the team have the same shared understanding of what informed consent actually means and how to achieve it. So it might be worth kind of running that through together at the beginning of the deployment or at the beginning of the day when you're going to be first gathering content. I suppose the third point is that you'll need to make sure, this is a very practical one, that you have enough consent forms printed out and they're in the right language if we've been able to provide them in the language that the beneficiaries speak. So all of these can be found in the Ops Knowledge resource. Just download them and get some printed out. Take more than you think you'll need. I've had serious situations where I've had too few and there's nothing you can do about that at the time unless you're carrying a printer with you. So just carry more than you think. And finally, if the beneficiary families don't speak the same language as the person gathering the content, then they'll definitely need to use an interpreter. Even if you're using a consent form that's translated, you'll still need to use an interpreter to engage with any questions that the beneficiary has and to explain the kind of how we'll be using their images in a more nuanced way. But what's really important is that that interpreter is also on board with what informed consent actually means and is fully briefed on how we achieve that prior to getting into the field. That kind of conversation with the interpreter shouldn't be happening just before you speak to the beneficiary or in front of them.
Okay, so we're going to go through the different types of consent forms that we have at ShelterBox. These consent forms can all be found in one place, which we'll guide you to at the end. So at the start, we're going to focus on community consent. Now, where possible, it's important that we get consent from a community leader. So this will cover the consent of the whole community, and it's important to make sure that everyone, as many people as possible, are there to hear that consent is being given, but also understand why we're there. So when you're approaching a community, a lot of the time when you first come to do an assessment, there'll be lots of people around and you'll usually speak to a community leader or a camp leader. So they will be the person you're getting consent from. So you speak to them about the consent forms, why you're doing it, and it would be great if that person can then pass that on to a secondary group leader or even a bigger group. Sometimes you find that people are the communities are sitting under the trees, everyone's interested to know what you're doing. So this is kind of the perfect time to get community consent. This community consent doesn't really allow you to take pictures of specific individuals, but this allows for community shots. So for example, this picture that's up now, this is a group community photo. So this will cover you for most people in this picture because no one is actually specifically focused on. So community consent is best for these types of shots. It's not always practically possible, and it's not always a requirement for scenic shots, but if there's lots of people in it, this is the best way to get the consent.
If you do want to take a portrait and you are focusing on one individual in your image, then you'll need an individual adult consent form. And you can see that in front of you. It's fairly self-explanatory and similar to the other one. You should start by reading aloud the wording from the consent form, which you can see. And you can use visual examples, which actually are at the bottom of the form. We've only shown the top half of it here in this image, but at the bottom, which you'll see later, there are some examples of the different kind of platforms that those images might be used on. So you can use that as a visual aid to explain where the content might be used. In addition, it's really important to make it clear to individuals that whether they agree to content gathering or not is not going to affect the distribution of aid. So if you're kind of going in prior, you're doing a needs assessment or prior to distributing aid, it's clear, it needs to be clear to them that that them agreeing to give their consent doesn't affect whether they're going to get aid or not. If you're going in afterwards, maybe at the kind of monitoring or evaluation stage, if you're not planning to bring any more aid, that also needs to be made clear to individuals. And also, of course, that there'll be no negative consequences for them or anyone else if they decide they don't want to take part and they don't want to give consent. They also need to be made aware that they're able to get in touch with us and change their mind about giving consent. But we'll talk about that a bit more later on. Of course, the person needs to be given enough time to absorb all the information and shouldn't feel under pressure to kind of make a rush decision if they want to ask someone else or have a little think about it first. Ideally, if you're talking to an individual who you're going to be taking a portrait of, that conversation shouldn't happen in the middle of a big crowd where kind of other people might be able to influence them. And if the beneficiary wants to use an alternative name, then they're very welcome to, and there's a space for that on the form. And if that's the case, then they don't have to state their real name. They can just use the false one throughout that form. Even if they do want to use their own name, there might be many reasons why you or the content team back at HQ might decide that that could present risk to them, and you might decide later on that using an alternative name is in their best interest. So, for example, in the case of victims of gender-based violence, a beneficiary's well-being and safety should always take priority over the need for an image or story. So even if they give their real name, it won't necessarily be used. Here's an example of a portrait of an individual who we needed to gather consent from to use this portrait.
So next is family consent. If it's a group shot of a family, then the consent needs to be a representative of this family, not necessarily an individual, each individual of that family. So it's important that you get the consent from say the mum or the dad of the family, and that covers you for the children as well. Make sure you get all of the kids' names and ages. You don't necessarily have to get their surnames. First names are always preferred, and we don't, mainly for safety reasons, we don't tend to use people's surnames. So don't worry about the family's name, family surname, but make sure you get the mother or the dad, and then you've got consent for the whole family. So that's good for family portraits. Like this picture here, this is a picture of Grace, and she gave us consent to use images and stories from her whole family.
So moving on to the child consent form, the most important differences between the child and the adult consent form is that a child under 13 years old will need consent from an appropriate adult. If this can't be their parent, then it could be another family member. The age of 13 is based on the legal requirement in GDPR legislation. However, if you're asking for consent directly from a child over 13, the principle of informed consent is even more important. So just make extra sure that you feel confident that that child understands what they're agreeing to and the implications of that, bearing in mind that they might say they understand, but if you're not confident they actually have understood, then that cannot be considered to be informed consent. You might need to explain that to them again, or use different language, or use questions to check their understanding. And if you're still not confident they understand, then you can't use the content of them. And here's an example of a child in Syria whose parent we needed to gain consent from to use this image.
So every person has the right to withdraw consent. At the bottom of each consent form, there is this selection of images. So this is what we would show someone, as Anna mentioned earlier. When you're asking for consent and you're asking for informed consent, we give examples to show people where their images and stories might be used. This is actually a nice way for people to get a real understanding of how you are using their content. But at the bottom of this, you'll rip off the consent form. We keep the consent, and at the bottom of this it says that you need obviously to work with your translator to make sure that they fully understand that they have the right to withdraw. And it basically says you've given permission for ShelterBox to use your story to tell the supporters about the work it does and raise money through fundraising. If you change your mind or would like more information, please contact the brand and content team at shelterbox.org. Now, we know that everyone doesn't necessarily have an email address, but also giving a phone number, we know that not everyone has a phone, but at least if someone in the community understands that they don't have to, they have the right to withdraw, then they have the option to hear. Also, I just want to say, if people don't want to give consent at the start, when you're asking for consent, that doesn't mean that you therefore don't get their story. I think if someone doesn't want to give consent, you should still give them the time to tell your story, because it's just as important. So don't feel that no consent means no images and therefore no further communication. No consent just means that they're not giving consent on a piece of paper or audio, but it's still an opportunity to listen to someone's story.
Just one thing to add on that, actually. Although people have the right to withdraw consent, they need to be aware that there's a risk that that image might already have been used. But if that's the case, then and they contact us to withdraw consent, it just means that the images won't be used again in the future.
Yeah. Okay, so there are different alternatives to written consent. As I said before, not everyone has, internet or can write. Not everyone is able to give consent in a written way, and it's also about people's dignity as well. If you're giving someone a pen and they can't write, but they've got people around them saying, this is how we would like consent, there's a lot of pressure on that person. So it's important to understand whether that person is willing to write maybe a scribble, or if not, give them an alternative way. So you can record it through audio or video, or you can do fingerprint consent, and we'll provide ink pads for this. It's just getting an understanding of what that person is willing to do, and they don't feel pressured into writing something when they can't write. Also, the main reason why we ask for written consent is because through a lot of our channels, when we want to share an image on, say, a press release, the newspapers often ask for written consent. But when it's through our websites or social media, a recorded consent, if that's the only thing that you can do at that time, is acceptable. Okay, so once you have consent and you're happy and confident that it's informed consent, it'd be great if you could take pictures of the consent forms or scan them and send them to us at brandandcontent@shelterbox.org, or give them to your team lead, and then they'll pass them on to the team. And the consent forms are stored in a secure folder in the branding content group, so no hard copies are kept, and it's secured so they won't be shared unless they're needed to. So so that's how you can share it with us.
Thanks very much for listening. If you have any questions about anything within this webinar or about consent in content gathering more broadly, feel free to get in touch using the email address brandandcontent@shelterbox.org.